Namaskar. Today we will be deliberating and discussing upon another very important topic in Salesforce management, which is managing expenses for sales personnel. In the previous lecture on compensation, we had seen how important compensation plans can be for an organization in attracting talent, in retaining talent, and also encouraging sales personnel to perform better on their job positions and on their job roles. We had also seen that a compensation plan comprises a fixed component, a variable component, fringe benefits and bonuses, and a very important portion of what sales personnel carry home every month comprises the reimbursements which they receive with respect to the selling expenses that they incur in the field. Now, managing expenses for sales personnel here in terms of the selling expenses which they incur while they are on their job in the field is very, very important because that keeps them moving, that keeps them on, putting in as much effort as they would be able to without worrying about the expenses that they are incurring on their travel, on their boarding, on their lodging, on their telephones, on the internet, etc. So there are companies which arrange for such reimbursements, and that is something which sales personnel really appreciate, and that itself acts as a motivating factor to keep them on their toes all the time with respect to the kind of efforts that they can put in while they are on the job. On the other hand, there are companies which have very tight budgetary controls on these, and there are also certain companies which do not reimburse at all. So we will see that when companies reimburse selling expenses for sales personnel, the impact is very different. Of course, they have options in doing so. They may reimburse in full, they may reimburse in part, and the different plans or the different reimbursement policies that they have need to be taken care of before deciding on the final decision with respect to which of the plans or which of the policies they would like to implement, because selling expenses themselves are have a big role to determine the profitability or the net profitability of a company. As we have seen, while salespersons play a very important role in earning huge sales volume for their salesperson for their company, similarly they also have a big role to play in determining the net profits of the company by incurring as less as possible selling expenses on the field. So what happens is that when they get huge sales for the company, what the company is able to earn gross profits, because sales minus cost of goods sold would be the gross profit of the company. But when sales personnel incur lesser expenses on their selling expense, it contributes to net profit, because net profit is calculated by subtracting the selling expenses from the gross profit. So the sales personnel not only can help improve the net profitability of a company, not only by increasing or generating huge sales, but also by doing so in lesser amount of selling expenses, which would help companies gain good net profits. So we will see that when companies allow for selling expenses reimbursement, they also must keep a tab or a control on the amount of selling expenses that they would be reimbursing, else it would dilute the net profits for a company. So in this particular session, we shall be talking about how should companies go about managing the expenses of their sales personnel. We shall be talking about the background and importance of managing expenses for sales personnel, the reimbursement policy and the alternatives for reimbursement of sales personnel, and then we shall also talk about the various methods for reimbursing expenses. So let us first start with an introduction and a background to why is reimbursement important. Now, reimbursement of sales expenses is a vital component in the sales compensation plan which I just mentioned, and the plan or the compensation plan that a company sets for the sales personnel must be very, very fair. the sales personnel must be able to meet their expenses and the company must be able to earn profitable sales. So on one hand, while these expenses must be met by organizations, care should also be taken that these expenses are not so high or not so much that the profits of the company get diluted. So before we go into a detailed discussion on Salesforce expenses, let us first see what we mean by Salesforce expenses. Now, Salesforce expenses here include expenses which are incurred on boarding, lodging, travel, mobile and internet charges, as well as the money which salespersons need to spend on gifts and on entertainment of the customer. So put together, all this comprises what we refer to as the selling expense. Now, organizations must keep a check on the Salesforce expenses and on the kind of expenses that salespersons on different jobs in different territories incur. So we refer to this as the Salesforce expense analysis, and the Salesforce expense analysis becomes important for three reasons. One, it acts as a control mechanism. Two, this has motivational implications, and three, it also has a bearing upon the power dynamics amongst Salesforce and amongst the management and the company. So what do we mean by the control mechanism here? Now, an efficient control mechanism is required to monitor and to assess Salesforce performance and expenses so that company can earn healthy net profits. It is also important for management to keep an account of individual Salesforce expenses, because that would determine the individual's contribution towards the profitability of an organization. An individual salesperson may be generating huge sales volumes for the company. He may be doing very well in his territory, but if he is doing so at the sake of huge selling expenses, it may mean that he may not be generating any profits at all, or he may be generating profits which are very less. So it's very, very important to keep a check on individual Salesforce individual salesperson's expenses. The second thing which is important here is motivational implications. Now, salespersons who have to incur their own selling expenses and there is no reimbursement from the company have a very different orientation as compared to those who are reimbursed expenses in full by the company or in part by the company. So the persons who do not get a reimbursement would be less motivated to sell more, as that would mean incurring higher expenses to be met by their own pocket, which is something which they may not want. So there is a motivational implication here, and we see that salespersons who are reimbursed their expenses in full or in part tend to be motivated enough to contribute towards selling and non-selling activities, as compared to those who feel that if they put in more effort to sell more, they would also have to incur high selling expenses, and they'll have to meet those expenses from their own pockets, which is something which they would not like to do. Now, the third is with respect to power dynamics between the management and the sales team or the sales force. Now, the management's power to direct and control is much higher in cases where the company reimburses expenses as compared to those where companies do not reimburse. Now, we know when companies would reimburse either in part or in full, they would also issue directives, they would also issue guidelines with respect to the kind of activities the salespersons must indulge in, their roles, their responsibilities, and the activities, whether it is with respect to selling and non-selling functions. But where in cases where management does not reimburse, it would have lesser control and would not be able to exercise and implement directives and guidelines with respect to tasks which the salespersons must perform. Because in cases where the expenses are reimbursed, the company would always have an upper hand, saying that yes, we give you so much, so you must do this. But in cases where companies do not allow for any reimbursements, in those cases, of course, they would not be able to exercise that kind of a control, and their power over the sales force or the sales personnel would be lesser. Now, it is very, very important that expenses are kept in control and companies reimburse only allowable expenses. So it's very important to keep expenses in control and reimburse allowable expenses. And issues that need to be addressed while formulating a sales expense policy are the nature of the product and service category, the size and characteristics of the sales territory, the sales potential, the sales quotas and the targets, the type of customers that the salesperson would be dealing with, the selling methods, the selling styles required, and differences in expenses across territories with respect to boarding, lodging, travel, etc. Now, I'll just give a brief explanation about the nature and size. The size and characteristics of the sales territory. Now, not all sales territories would be having the same potential, same selling potential. They would differ with respect to the sales expenses also, because there would be huge differences in terms of the cost of travel, boarding, lodging across these territories. Also, the kind of customers which a salesperson may be dealing with in the different territories may be different. In certain cases, he would be dealing with the dealers and distributors, especially in the case of B2C. In others, he would be dealing with the buying center where multiple sales calls are required, which would be more in the case of B2B. In certain situations, he would be dealing with already existing customers, so he would be into service selling. In others, he would be dealing with new customers, or he would be responsible for generation of new customers, where it would involve leads, prospects, calls and multiple sales calls before a prospect is converted into a customer. So what we are referring to is developmental selling. So based on all of these, whether it is the product or service in question, whether it is the nature of the sales territory in terms of potential, in terms of competition, in terms of kind of customers, or whether it is with respect to developmental selling and service selling, or whether it is with respect to the kind of customers that the salesperson has to deal with, B2B or B2C, and also with respect to the selling styles and the selling methods that he must adopt, the sales expense policy across territories would vary, and this is an issue which needs to be addressed. So it's very, very important that the reimbursement policy takes into account all of these factors before selling expense per territory, per salesperson is determined. Now, coming to the reimbursement policy and alternatives for reimbursements of selling expenses. Now, while deciding on a reimbursement policy, companies may opt from a few alternatives that are available. One alternative is that the salespersons pay for their own expenses, which would mean that the company does not reimburse at all. The second is when companies reimburse the expenses which are incurred by the salespersons, and here this would mean that companies formulate a sales expense reimbursement policy for their sales staff. The policy has to be something which is perceived as fair and equitable to the sales personnel across territories, and it should be simple to understand and very economical to administer. Of course, as I said, differences have to be taken into account while deciding on the allowable expenses for the sales personnel across territories. So the amount of control that companies exercise over sales expenses of its salespersons will vary across companies. Some companies are very, very strict and exercise close budgetary controls, wherein control is exercised over the kind as well as the amount of expenses that can be incurred. So in some companies there are strict budgetary controls, whereas in others there is a lot of flexibility. So whatever be the policy, whether it is to reimburse in part or in full, it's very important that territorial differences are taken into account before deciding on matters of allowable selling expenses per territory, per salesperson, across territories, across control units or states or countries, etc. And the amount of control that this companies exercise over the sales expense of its salesperson will vary again across companies. Some companies would want close budgetary controls, and so the reimbursement policy there would be very rigid and very tight, and it may not allow for any and every kind of expense. On the other hand, there are certain companies which allow for a very relaxed approach and would reimburse anything and everything which the salespersons ask for. Now, let's first take such a scenario where the salespersons pay for their own expense. Now, this particular option, if adopted by organizations, is something which would prove to be a very simple method. But however, this method is not widely adopted or accepted by sales personnel worldwide. The reason being, that the people would sooner or later begin to get demotivated and would not want to spend much time, taking up roles and responsibilities which have the potential of increasing business, because they would feel that taking on more responsibilities, indulging in more selling and non-selling activities would actually mean paying the expenses from one's own pocket. However, this method is adopted by those organizations that consider sales personnel as independent entities. For example, in the case of brokers and agents, where their commissions are paid to them and they are left on their own to manage their own selling expenses. Now, the advantages of this system is that it's very less costly for the organization. There is no need to maintain records, as salespeople manage their own expenses, and then there is no question of any reimbursement. However, there are disadvantages of this method also. As I said, it can lead to demotivation. In addition, when sales expenses are not paid by the company, salespersons would avoid non-selling activities and would not like to follow up with customers to avoid extra expenses. They may defy management's directives, orders and instructions. Management would have little control over them, and hence such organizations who do not have a reimbursement policy make up by providing huge commissions to their independent entities, or to the independent entities, be it the brokers and the agents. So, they make up by providing higher commissions. The second scenario is where companies reimburse the expenses incurred by salespeople. Now, here again the company may allow full reimbursement or only a partial reimbursement. Now, companies paying full expenses and companies reimbursing expenses partially may end up with different kinds of reactions from their salespersons in terms of performance, in terms of service selling, and in terms of developmental selling. How? Let's first talk about companies which pay full expenses. Now, management here has full control over the salesperson's activities and they can exercise their authority. However, there would be a tendency towards unethical behavior and salespersons would overspend. This would mean that the net profits of the company may get diluted. Just because the company is going to pay full, people would spend more, and they would also want to claim for those kinds of expenses which are unnecessary. In those cases where companies reimburse expenses partially, the management would be able to control salesperson's activities. However, the policy needs to be formulated very carefully so that allowable expenses can be properly set, and this would require a territory by territory analysis regarding the sales potential, regarding general expense conditions in those territories, also keeping in mind the kind of customers in those territories, the selling styles required, etc. So, given the scenario where companies pay full expenses, management would have full control and would be able to direct and guide the sales force to do to indulge in selling and non-selling activities, and to cater to selling of big ticket items, small ticket items equally, which would mean selling balanced orders. The company would be able to direct them towards lead generation, prospecting. They would they would also be able to exercise control with respect to service selling, that means selling to current customers and maintaining goodwill, and good interpersonal relationships with their existing customers, which again would mean a non-selling activity. So, where there are commissions involved, so they would be able to exercise control. But in those cases where companies pay expenses partially or reimburse expenses partially, management will be able to control their activities, but the policy has to be properly formulated so that the salesperson do not take advantage of the situation, and they are well in control, can be well directed with respect to the kind of activities that they have to be performing. Now, management needs to keep a control on the expenses, as these are a part of the gross profits and can dilute net profits. The reimbursement policy must be very rational, must be very reasonable. It must ensure that the reimbursable expenses allow smooth conduct of duties and responsibilities, as well as direct the performance of both selling and non-selling activities. It must ensure that the performance of the salespersons is satisfactory, and the selling expenses are not so huge that they dilute the net profits of the company. The reimbursement policy should also be easy to implement with the least amount of paperwork and record keeping, and it should also make the employees feel that they are being treated well and by the company. So never should they feel that they are not being treated well by their organization. So first is that the policy has to be something which is very rational and reasonable. It should ensure that the reimbursable expenses allow smooth conduct of business, smooth conduct of performance of selling and non-selling activities, and it should ensure that people in the field are able to perform their duties satisfactorily. It should also make the employees feel that the company cares for them, they are being treated well by the company, and it should also be something which is easy to implement and with the least amount of paperwork and record keeping. Now, what are the different methods of reimbursing expenses? We have 4 different methods of reimbursing expenses. The first is a flat expense method, the second is a flexible expense method, the third is an honor system, and the fourth is the expense quota. So let us first talk about the flat expense account. In the flat expense account, a predetermined, a predefined fixed amount of money is paid to the sales personnel for a given is paid to the salesperson for a given amount of given period of time. Now, this period of time could be weekly, could be monthly. In most cases, it is monthly, and the salesperson must manage the allocation of expenses under different heads on his own. The different heads being boarding, lodging, travel, entertainment expenses on salespersons, etc. So, what the salesperson gets on a weekly or on a monthly basis is a fixed sum, and he must then manage those funds on different heads. He must allocate sensibly between boarding, lodging, travel, entertaining his customers, etc. Now, there are merits as well as demerits to this method. The merits being that the company formulates a policy after determining the expense conditions in a particular territory, and once this is done, a fixed reimbursement allowance is paid on a periodic basis to the salesperson. So the company does not need to check expense accounts, it does not need to maintain records, and there is less amount of paperwork. Second, salespersons have the freedom and flexibility to use the allowance as they want. They do not need to preserve bills of any kind, they do not need to keep receipts of any kind, and so they also don't have to make claims. So they save on the time which would be utilized for making claims. The method works best only when regular changes with respect to determining the fixed selling expense amounts are not required, and in cases when expense allowances are reviewed from time to time and revised. It's only and only in these 2 conditions that this method holds good, because a frequent revisioning is happening, a frequent review is happening, and which means that the amount which is being formulated as a fixed flat amount is something which would be good enough for a salesperson to be able to meet his needs, or to be able to meet his selling expenses in the field. The periodic revision, the periodic review helps ascertain that this is something which is good enough for a salesperson to be able to meet his expenses. As and when it is realized that the amount needs to be increased because of increases in travel cost or boarding and lodging cost, in those cases it is reviewed and it is revised. So the company is able to decide on amount which is good enough for a particular period and then of course subsequent changes can be made. The demerits of this system is that the management would need to appraise the fixed amount periodically and make adjustments due to changing marketing conditions, and so this would mean cost in terms of both time and money. And another problem with this method is that the salesperson often regard this amount as a part of their salary, as an add-on to the salary, and they are always inclined towards over economizing for travel or for stay, so that they can save money for themselves. So these are the demerits of the flat expense method. The second is the flexible expense account. Now, the flexible expense account is also called the exact plan, and it's a very commonly used method. The salespersons are asked to report their expenses periodically, and they are reimbursed the permissible selling expenses which are reported, of course, with bills, with legitimate bills. So, for calculation of the reimbursement amount, management must know the probable expenses of a salesperson, in a territory, and you must understand what is permissible and what is not, and accordingly expenses must be categorized as allowable and non-allowable. So, the method requires that procedures be established for verifying the itemized expense reports of the sales personnel, and based on what is allowable and what is not allowable, the various items in the expense report are examined, and again based on what is allowed and what is not allowed, the reimbursements are made. So, the salesperson is asked to give an itemized report on his expenses, and these expenses are examined for permissibility or non-permissibility, and accordingly the reimbursements are made for those for the amount which is admissible or for the amount which is allowable. Now, what are the merits and demerits of this particular method? The merit is that it is a very fair method, very flexible, as it takes into account territorial differences with respect to market conditions as well as the cost of living, etc. in particular area. Management can exercise better control and provide directives for selling activities, be it sales calls or frequency of sales calls, as well as non-selling activities and routing and scheduling. Now, routing and scheduling is something which we shall be discussing next week when we do the sales territories. So, the management here can exercise better control over its sales personnel. It can issue guidelines and directives with respect to the kind of emphasis that the salesperson must lay on selling activities and non-selling activities, as well as on routing and scheduling. Salespersons do not avoid going for regular follow-ups, as they are reimbursed for all of the allowable expenses that they incur. So, that keeps them motivated and that keeps them on their toes towards making efforts for making profitable sales. Of course, this particular method also suffers from certain demerits. The method is difficult to administer, it is time consuming, as a large amount of time is spent by salespeople in making bills, submitting them for reimbursements, making claims, etc. So, a lot of time and effort is spent by the account staff in checking these expense reports as well, verifying them and settling claims. So, overall it is a very time consuming process. On one hand, the salesperson has to make bills, has to submit these bills for reimbursements. So, he has to make these claims, and all this requires a lot of paperwork, and which means a lot of time goes into doing this activity. Similarly, the accounts people have to spend a lot of time checking these reports, verifying those expenses and settling the claim. So, it is a very time consuming process. Also, salespersons may overspend in the absence of adequate checks and supervision, and this overspending may sometimes be on certain heads, or certain kinds of expenses may be made which are unnecessary and not required. So, these are the demerits associated with this method. The third is the honor system. Now, as the word goes honor, we can link it with trust, we can link it with integrity, and so it actually denotes a kind of a trust which is shared between the company and the sales personnel, and the sales personnel here are regarded as somebody who are very truthful and very honest. So, keeping this as a premise, selling expenses are fully reimbursed in the case of honor system. So the salespeople are not required to submit full details of the expenses that they have incurred. They do not have to submit item wise reports or of expenses. They are only asked to report the total expenses that have been, the total expense that has been incurred by them, and the entire amount is fully reimbursed. Merits and demerits of the honor system. Now, as far as the merits are concerned, the method is easy to manage and also time consuming. No elaborate bills are required, no elaborate item wise reporting is required. It's only that the sales people must mention the total expenses that have been incurred by them, and these expenses are then reimbursed. Also, the method is less conflicting, as chances of arguments over doubtful and or questionable expenses either with the sales managers or with the accounts team do not arise. However, the system has demerits. The management has little control over expenses. Sales personnel may overspend on their own selves, and this would affect the overall profitability of the organizations. Funds may be used abusively, and they may be seen as an extra source of income. Hence, the company must keep an eye on controlling individual expenses, and if there is a sudden spurt in expenses, these need to be checked. If there is some a sudden rise in the kind of expenses that are being incurred, that also must be checked. Now, coming to the fourth method of reimbursement, which is the expense quota. Now, the expense quota method allows periodic variations in reimbursement allowances. It allows week to week or month wise variations, but controls the expenses in the long run. So, expense quotas are defined by the management, and this requires an evaluation of the sales territories and prospective sales volume in those territories. Once the sales volume for the territories are estimated, an upper cap or an upper limit for the expenses is set by the management, and accordingly control is exercised. The merits of this system is that it's a very timely and full reimbursements are made to the salespeople regardless of periodic variations week wise or month wise. As upper limits are prescribed, salespeople exercise personal restraint and personal control and keep their selling expenses well within limits, and the sales personnel are entrusted with the responsibility of controlling their own selling expenses. However, the system also has demerits. The implementation of the system requires careful planning and implementation. Accurate sales and expense forecasts are required, else in order to keep their expenses within the upper limit, sales personnel may avoid taking additional roles and responsibilities. They may avoid non-selling activities, and this could be a problem for the organization. So, with this we come to an end of this lecture. The references are still and Kandif, Govani and Puri, Sales and Distribution Management, Pearson, India; Panda and Sehdev, Sales and Distribution Management, Oxford University Press, 2011 and 12; Havaldar and Kawale, Sales and Distribution Management, Texts and Cases, 3rd edition, 2017, McGraw-Hill. This brings us to an end of the 4th lecture on the 6th module of the course. We shall begin with our discussion on the next topic, which is evaluation of sales force, in the next lecture. Thank you.